Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting on Episode 2 of My Hero Academia. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. So just to recap everything that had happened so far, young Midoriya here doesn't have a quirk, meaning he has no superpowers, but despite that, he wants to be a superhero. He has a bit of a chance encounter with his idol All Might, sort of Superman analog, and he's asked the all-important question: without a quirk, can I still become a superhero? And just to ratchet up the drama a little bit, we were sort of left with a cliffhanger. We didn't get All Might's answer, but, given how he's sort of composed himself, it's not to say that he's being less than heroic, but, there's a sort of cynicism about him that, sort of indicates that he might say, give up on your dream. And, I don't know, in a way, this is a really big bummer of a beginning where, all of this kid's hopes and dreams are sort of crushed before his very eyes at a relatively young age, and things haven't really improved since then. So, it seems obvious, but, if you're just powerless, obviously you can't be somebody quite like All Might, but that said, it's not like there's nothing he can do. There are other ways to help, even if you're not a superhero. There is good work that can be done, good in the sense of, morally good. But before we get into any of that, it would seem as though we're going to get a nice little plot development here. All Might is, in truth, rather emaciated and skeletal. And it seems like he's not too happy to sort of show off this side of himself. It's not exactly common knowledge or public knowledge or anything like that. No doubt to somebody like Midoriya, it's rather shocking. So, as if this whole business with All Might not being exactly as he presents himself weren't bad enough, it would seem as though the villain he had apprehended is not quite in the secure custody he perhaps should be in. Oh dear. Just like that, a little careless action frees a rather ruthless and dangerous villain. And This guy, he saw fit to sort of like wear a random person's body like a skin suit. Granted, in this case it couldn't happen to a worse person, but even so, he's a jerk, but I don't think suffocating is necessarily commensurate. I mean, at the very least, he seems concerned about the consequences of his actions if it would prevent him from getting into UA. So, that shows some sort of moral reasoning. He's not totally off the deep end. So back to Midoriya. This has got to be a real unsettling revelation here. I guess the natural thing is to assume that there's something weird going on here. This isn't as it seems, this guy might be an imposter or something. Unfortunately, no, this is just reality and how it is. It really does sort of deflate All Might's legend, no pun intended. So yeah, things are getting pretty real. All Might is tacitly admitting that a lot of the public perception of him is merely perception and not truth, He confronts evil with a smile, but there's fear behind that smile. He has this horrible flesh wound that, by his own admission, cost him a bunch of internal organs. It's really sort of depressing in a way that this great superhero, sustained this injury and he's still trying to keep up his career, but he's sort of in a position where he can't admit that he has been weakened as much as he has. And All Might has even gone to lengths to sort of keep the fight that got him injured under wraps. He himself admits that most people don't even know that it happened. That almost makes it worse, if nobody knows it happened and, you suddenly get yourself crippled, but you still have the responsibility of being a superhero, Like, you almost can't explain it to people. So ultimately, All Might gives him the bad news. Some villains, you just need a superpower to beat them. Without that, you're sort of out of luck. So his sort of alternative is, become a cop. You can handle non-superhero related crime. On its face, that's not necessarily some bad advice, that you should sort of be realistic about things. But at the same time, for somebody like All Might to tell you that to your face, that's gotta sting a lot. I mean, All Might can't know what precisely this kid's going through, but to just sort of say something like that, that kind of goes against his character and his public persona. I do think it's also interesting that All Might was talking about being a hero in terms of whether or not you can become a licensed hero. The idea being you can't be a superhero, but that, at least to me, that does not preclude heroism. Being a hero is... essentially, it's doing what's right, regardless of the difficulty. You don't need to have superpowers to do what's right. So the situation is dire. This slime monster is able to sort of shrug off some of the heroes we saw in action before. If this guy is capable of fighting off like actual professional licensed superheroes, then that means in some way he's serious business. Maybe he's not like an A-list supervillain, but it would seem as though he takes more than a run-of-the-mill superhero to be defeated. So, I'm sort of torn about how the police officer in this situation was just sort of relegated to keeping the crowd back. All Might is telling Midoriya, you can be a cop, that's a good, honest profession, but like, the cop's not doing much in this instance, yeah, he's keeping civilians from causing more trouble and panic, but like, that is a poor substitution for being a superhero, no matter how you slice it. To see the action going on, but to be unable to engage, be it by protocol or your own lack of ability, that's gotta be a rather galling thing. So it's interesting that even this early on in the story, we're sort of seeing the failings of superheroes. Not necessarily through any fault of their own, it just so happens that the heroes involved are incapable of handling the villain. And All Might, as a result of his injuries, is sort of strictly limited to 3 hours worth of heroic activity. I mean, at the very least, there's like a glimmer of hope. All Might recognizes that his inability to do anything is pathetic in the extreme. As cynical as he was being earlier, that little spark of just being annoyed with himself, like, that's evidence that there is still something worthwhile. So this is essentially a big fork in the road here. Midoriya has been told by essentially everyone, the highest authority that he regards, that he cannot become a superhero. But regardless of whether or not he can become a superhero, it would seem as though a chance for heroism is presenting itself. It's the same villain from before. Naturally, he would assume that his sort of intervening with All Might distracted him and allowed the villain to escape, so that's guilt. It's his fault that this villain is now rampaging again. And, if that weren't enough, the supervillain's victim is somebody he knows personally, and even if that guy picks on him mercilessly, it's very difficult to just stand by and watch somebody suffer. There's that saying, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. And I think that's sort of indicative that there's just like this human instinct to not enjoy the suffering of others. And speaking of suffering of others, All Might, I'd imagine, is suffering mentally. Everybody is sort of talking, where's All Might? Surely he could take care of this, but none of them know that he doesn't really have the capacity at the moment to do anything. I think it's interesting that both Midoriya and All Might are sort of maybe wallowing in self-pity is too strong, but they're both deeply ashamed of their own actions. I'd have to say it's a fairly intentional thing that they're sort of drawing a parallel between Midoriya and All Might in their mindset. And so here we have it, without a quirk, without a license, without so much as a plan, really, Midoriya charges in to waylay the monster. And this is essentially the essence of heroism, doing what's right, regardless of difficulty, regardless of feasibility. So it is kind of interesting that through his study of other heroes, he's sort of able to, pull something out in an attempt to distract the villain. That's also an interesting admission there that, he doesn't really know what he's doing. He just sort of started moving on an impulse. That's sort of, I would think, more evidence of one's suitability for heroism over anything else. Essentially the impulse to do what is right regardless of consequences. Unfortunately, it would seem as though Midoriya's heroic actions have inspired All Might to, essentially, transcend his limits, likely at the cost of his health, to take care of the situation. So there we have it, in the nick of time, he shows up to save the day again. Optimism has triumphed over cynicism. It's interesting that All Might, being the pinnacle of heroism that he is, had almost seemed to forget what it was all about, Being a superhero, yeah, it's kind of a glamorous job, but it's not like there's no danger. You have to put your life on the line, and if All Might was sort of hanging back because he was injured, what hero is he? So he really has no choice but to sort of suck it up and do what needs to be done. Fortunately, he was able to do it. So just to showcase how powerful All Might is and how, I guess, the disparity between how he was in his prime and how he is now in his emaciated form, how great that disparity is, it's clear that his punch was so powerful it shifted the clouds and caused it to start raining. There was a scene like that in One Punch Man that I was rather fond of, where Saitama punched the Deep Sea King to death, really, and additionally, parted the clouds and stopped a rainstorm. I have to say, that is a really effective way of showing just how powerful someone is. Altering the weather at large scale just by punching. So even though everything turned out well, there are a couple interesting new plot wrinkles. Obviously the heroes can't condone what Midoriya did. He himself is not a hero, so they can't condone what is essentially vigilantism. And at the same time, everybody's praising Bakugo, because despite being in the situation he was in, he maintained a relatively level head, all things considered. But Bakugo was put in a position where somebody he considered distinctly his inferior went out of his way to help him for no real personal gain. It was purely an altruistic act. So naturally, Bakugo has to deny that Midoriya did anything worthwhile. And I'm sort of reminded of, a whole host of characters, really. The tsundere archetype, where they can't be honest for fear of, appearing weak or otherwise not in keeping with their persona. So fortunately, it would seem as though All Might has given some thought to the question, and perhaps he's arrived at a different answer. Midoriya essentially had inspired him, reigniting a fire that once burned presumably a lot brighter than it does now. It is interesting that All Might notes that if Midoriya hadn't explained his exact situation as it was, then his actions wouldn't have been nearly as meaningful. It's also interesting that All Might brings up how this phenomenon of acting on impulse heroically is a common thing amongst great heroes. If nothing else, that's kind of a tacit admission on his part that he does indeed have the makings of a hero, if not all the right tools. So there we have it, from the mouth of All Might, Midoriya does indeed have the capability of becoming a hero. It's notable that he says, or rather he never says it's going to be easy, but possible is better than impossible, that's for certain. Alright, well that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.